Welcome to Health and Disease. This is our first lesson of biology. We're done with physics now. Hopefully that's good news. We thought we would go on to health and disease since it's all very relevant to our life at the moment. These first few lessons are going to be looking at different diseases, how we catch them, how we don't catch them, and how our body protects us from them. Okay, so we'll start as ever, 5-6 starter questions. First one of which is, a 5 kilogram bag is carried 10 meters. How much work is done? So this is what we looked at last lesson, hopefully. 2, state the word equation for photosynthesis. If you think way back, been teaching my 8-year-old brother in this weird school closure time. We did photosynthesis the other day. Imagine how excited he is to have me around teaching him. Every other kid gets time off. 3, explain the shape of the graph above. That's photosynthesis versus carbon dioxide concentration. Another topic we did right at the start of the year. 4, aspirin has a melting point of 138 degrees C. Which of the samples below is the purest? So having a look at that table here. You're given data in a question, make sure you're always using it. 5, what is this bit of an enzyme called? And 6, an 850 watt microwave is used to heat a meal for 30 seconds. How much energy is transferred? So again, something that you should have looked at last lesson, last week. Okay, good. So our answers then. First one, you needed to do the distance times by the mass. So 5 times by 10 is 50 joules. For photosynthesis, plants take in water plus carbon dioxide to create glucose and oxygen. That graph showed that as you increase the rate of carbon dioxide, the rate of photosynthesis initially increases, but it stops, it levels off that graph when something else becomes the limiting factor. There are a couple of other limiting factors for photosynthesis. They are light intensity and heat, so it's one of those other two things that's limiting photosynthesis going faster still. Sample B was the one with the melting point closest to that of pure aspirin, so it was the purest. The squiggly bit in an enzyme is the active site, and you had to do your power, your watts, times by your time, your seconds, and that's 25,500, and that should be joules on the end there. Energy transferred is in joules. Good. So we're looking at health and disease today. This is something we should all absolutely be experts on at the moment. It's the reason you're sat in your house right now rather than having the joy of me stood in front of you shouting all this at you, as is good and proper. Okay. So today we need to know the difference between communicable and non-communicable diseases, describe how diseases are caused by pathogens and explain how they're spread, and explain how the spread of diseases can be prevented. So after all of this, you will be good to head up the next government briefing on coronavirus. You can take the place of the chief scientific officer. So first thing is to think of examples of diseases for yourself. You will be able to think of hundreds of these. You will have had loads of these in your time. You could come up with an exhausting list of lots of different diseases. I had a go myself. These were the ones that I came up with. So HIV, a cold, flu, cholera, measles, malaria, CVD, which is cardiovascular disease, things like heart attacks, chickenpox, meningitis, and diabetes. This is a huge list of, you could have a much bigger list of this again. And you might think, right at the moment, coronavirus is so much in the news, why have I missed that off this list? Well, the common cold is a type of coronavirus. So even this list, you could break things down into lots of different types. So there are lots and lots of different types of meningitis. There are 2 types of diabetes that we've looked at. So there are thousands of diseases, and often those diseases can be broken down into further categories still. But all of them have something in common, because we define a disease as this. It is any condition that impairs the normal function of an organism. So all of these things, they all go about this in a different way and to different degrees. A cold isn't very serious at all. Cholera is a lot more serious. A cold is extremely different to diabetes, but quite similar to flu, all of which they impair our normal function in some way, whether that's a runny nose or something much worse. It's you're not working properly. Okay? And they can be caused by a few different things. So the one that we're all worried about at the moment is infections by pathogens, but it can also be a mutation in an organism's genes or environmental conditions. So lots of diseases are caused by the environment. You're exposed to something and it makes you ill. Other illnesses like cancer, like diabetes, like cardiovascular disease are often caused by something wrong within your genes. It's a genetic condition. But most of the things on my list, most of the things that we generally think about when we think of disease, are these here: infections by pathogens, things that are spread from person to person, and that's what we're looking at today. Communicable diseases are ones that can be passed from one person to another, and they're caused by pathogens. And I say here person to person, that's as we are or hopefully all aware, that's a bit of a limited definition there, because it's from any organism to any other organism. We think at the moment that the coronavirus came from bats, mutated and swapped to another animal, and then mutated again and came on to humans. Well, it's still a communicable disease. It's still being spread from organism to organism. It doesn't have to be person to person. Okay. Communicable diseases is a huge range, as we've just seen. Common cold, coronavirus, HIV, flu, they have a huge range of different symptoms and onsets. Onsets is how quickly that disease goes for, or that pathogen goes from getting inside your body to actually starting to affect you, to ultimately you getting better or you not getting better. So the reason you have to isolate for 14 days if you've got the coronavirus is that that's the period of time in which it takes for those symptoms to become or to start to show. Before that, it hasn't started. So the onset is between 7 and 14 days. Before that, we say it's in its latency period, which means it's sort of just floating around in the background. HIV you can live with for years and years and years before you start showing symptoms. So the onset can be very varied, as can the symptoms. So now we need to go on and look a little bit more at our pathogens, because pathogens is a nice collective term for all the different ways in which illness can spread. It's a collective term for the idea of germs. At the moment, the government's advertising on the coronavirus uses the word germs a lot, as it's a nice broad term and less scientific than pathogen. Okay, so pathogens are microbes. They're something that gets inside you and makes you ill, and there are 4 types that we need to know about. And hopefully we are aware of a couple of them, and a couple are slightly more obscure. Good. So our first one is bacteria, and these are very small cells. They get inside your body and they make you ill. And I've written this slide and I write bacteria first, because most people, at least up until a few weeks ago, a few months ago, bacteria was the one that we were all most aware of. Bacteria is the one that you'd all shout out in class. I guess if I asked that same question now, you'd get a slightly different answer. So bacterial infections, this is what food poisoning is. You eat something dodgy, bacteria gets inside you, it releases toxins and makes you ill. But lots of other illnesses can be bacterial as well. Every one of you listening to this will have had a illness, a disease caused by bacteria at some point in your life. So next one, the one that we should all be very familiar with at the moment, is a virus, as in coronavirus. Viruses are not cells, they are not living things. They live in this kind of grey area between living and not living. They're much, much smaller than bacteria, and the way that they make you ill is they get inside you, they multiply lots and lots and lots and lots of times, and then they cause cells to burst. And when they burst, that virus spreads through your body and it makes you ill. This is why the coronavirus, you can have it for a few days and you can not show any symptoms, or indeed why some people appear not to show symptoms at all. You don't necessarily, this bursting doesn't happen to the same amount to everyone, but once it does burst, it can get all around the body and it can make you ill. But equally, some viruses don't make you that ill at all. Some people don't show very severe symptoms, some people show much more severe symptoms. Viruses generally, because they are smaller and they get inside cells, they are harder to treat, and that's something that we are all seeing at the moment. Good. So next, protists. This is something that you might not necessarily have heard of, but these are parasites. Parasites are something that lives off a host. It sucks its nutrients, it sucks its energy, its life force in order to feed itself. It's very much like the way that students sort of steal the energy of their teacher, making themselves stronger and their teacher weaker. Parasites live on a host, make themselves stronger and the host weaker. The example you need to be aware of this is malaria, and we'll look at that a little bit more later, or at least you will. And then finally, fungi. These are cell structures that are able to get inside skin and cause diseases and infections that way. These are quite rare. You get them from actual fungi, like the mushroom kind of things. If you've ever had athlete's foot, that would be an example of a fungus. You need to come into contact with it, or at least come into contact with the spores, which is the things that these fungi are able to spit out at you. Okay, good. So all of these are spread around in a mixture of different ways. So this video now is all about how these things can spread and how they're able to move from person to person, and how different pathogens are able to spread around the world. And every year I've been teaching, I've shown this video, and I've started it with a this is the thing we all need to be worried about. One day something will mutate and it will attack us all, and it will kill lots of people, and it will be terrible, and it will be scary, and we all need to be concerned. And generally when I was saying it, I thought I was BSing a little bit. I was having a bit of fun. I was scaring some children. I have never been more sad to be wrong and to have been scaring those children absolutely correctly, as now look at us sat in our homes watching this instead of being in class, all because I was right about this video. Okay, so if we watch this and then come back so I can tell you what you've got to do.
We live in an interconnected and increasingly globalized world. Thanks to international jet travel, people and the diseases they carry can be in any city on the planet in a matter of hours. And once the virus touches down, sometimes all it takes is one sneeze to spread the infection throughout the community. When humans were hunter-gatherers roaming the wild savannas, we were never in one place long enough, and settlements were not large enough to sustain the transmission of infectious microbes. But with the advent of the agricultural revolution 10,000 years ago, and the arrival of permanent settlements in the Middle East, people began living side by side with animals, facilitating the spread of bacteria and viruses between cattle and humans. Epidemics and pandemics come in many shapes and forms. In 2010, for instance, a devastating earthquake struck Haiti, forcing thousands of people into temporary refugee camps. Within weeks, the camps had become breeding grounds for cholera, a bacteria spread by contaminated water, triggering a countrywide epidemic. But the most common cause of epidemics are viruses such as measles, influenza, and HIV. And when they go global, we call them pandemics. Pandemics have occurred throughout human history. Some have left scars on the tissue and bone of their victims, while evidence for others comes from preserved DNA. For instance, scientists have recovered DNA from the bacteria that transmits tuberculosis from the remains of ancient Egyptian mummies. And in 2011, scientists investigating a plague pit in the City of London were able to reconstruct the genome of Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for the Black Death of the 14th century. It is thought the plague originated in China in around 1340, spreading west along the Silk Road, the caravan route running from Mongolia to the Crimea. In 1347, the plague reached the Mediterranean, and by 1400 it had killed in excess of 34 million Europeans, earning it the title, the Great Mortality. It was later historians who called it the Black Death. However, by far the greatest pandemic killer is influenza. Flu is constantly circulating between the southern and northern hemispheres. In North America and Europe, seasonal flus occur every autumn and winter. As the majority of children and adults will have been exposed to the virus in previous seasons, these illnesses are usually mild. However, every 20 to 40 years or so, the virus undergoes a dramatic mutation. Usually this occurs when a wild flu virus circulating in ducks and farm poultry meets a pig virus and they exchange genes. This process is known as antigenic shift and has occurred throughout human history. The first recorded pandemic occurred in 1580. The 18th and 19th centuries saw at least 6 further pandemics. In terms of mortality, none can compare with the Great Flu pandemic of 1918. The first indication of the pandemic came in the spring, when American troops in northern France began complaining of chills, headaches, and fever. Then, the following September, at a US Army barracks near Boston, soldiers started collapsing on parade, prompting their removal to the camp infirmary. As a surgeon there recalled, 2 hours after admission they have the mahogany spots over the cheekbones, and a few hours later you can begin to see the cyanosis extending from their ears and spreading all over the face. It is only a matter of a few hours then until death comes, and it is simply a struggle for air until they suffocate. On the SS Leviathan, a huge American transport en route to Bordeaux, sick men hemorrhaged blood from their noses, turning the decks between their bunks slick with bodily fluids. Meanwhile, British soldiers returning from northern France on furlough introduced the flu to Dover and other Channel ports, from where the virus was carried by rail to London. By the time the pandemic had run its course in April 1919, an estimated 675,000 Americans and 230,000 Britons were dead. In India alone, some 10 million were killed. And worldwide, the death toll was an astonishing 50 million. But that was then. Today, planes can transport viruses to any country on the globe in a fraction of the time it took in 1918. In February 2003, for instance, a Chinese doctor arrived at the Metropole Hotel in Hong Kong feeling unwell. Unknown to him, he was harboring a new animal origin virus called SARS, short for Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome. Within 24 hours of checking into room 913, 16 other guests had been infected, and over the following days, 5 boarded planes to overseas destinations, spreading the virus to Vietnam, Singapore, and Canada. Flights between Hong Kong, Toronto, and other international cities were quickly grounded, and thanks to other emergency measures, a pandemic was averted. By the time the outbreak was over 4 months later, SARS had infected 29 countries worldwide, and more than 1,000 people were dead. For all that the virus was rapidly contained, however, there was little that could be done about the alarming news reports carried by cable news channels and the internet. As bloggers added to the hysteria by spreading unfounded conspiracy theories, tourism in Hong Kong and other affected cities ground to a halt, costing businesses more than $10 billion. One business, however, did very well. Above all, SARS was a reminder that pandemics have always been associated with panic. If history teaches us anything, it is that while pandemics may start small, their impacts can be as dramatic as wars and natural disasters. The difference today is that science gives us the ability to detect pandemics right at the very beginning, and to take action to mitigate their impacts before they spread too widely.
Watched that, enjoyed that. Probably needs a bit of an update now. And it certainly had a good few more views since I last showed it to a class. So we need to go on now and look at the ways in which diseases are spread in general and the ways in which we prevent the spread of diseases in general. So they can be spread in a number of different ways. So diseases can be spread in water, through air, through direct contact, through bodily fluids, through animal vectors, soil, and through food. So some of these might be obvious to you, some of them might be a little less obvious to you. We'll talk about some of them in a bit more detail. Some of them you'll get a chance to look up in a second. First little note on this is whenever you look at diseases, you're not just talking about animals, you need to think about plants as well, which is why soil's on here. And it will come up again in a minute as well. So a couple of these to think about a little bit. Water is obviously a massive cause for way of diseases spreading, cause of disease. It's why it's so important to have clean water, because without clean water you become incredibly susceptible to a huge number of diseases. Chief amongst them is cholera, which is a disease that used to kill an awful lot of people. It causes severe diarrhea and dehydration, which is very difficult to recover from if you don't have access to a hospital. This is why when there are natural disasters, getting clean water is often a priority. Okay. Vectors is a word that most people wouldn't have been familiar with until recently. It's been used an awful lot in the news at the moment. A vector is a carrier for a disease. So at the moment, we are all vectors for the coronavirus. Animal vectors are something that carries a disease around. So the one you need to know about is malaria. Malaria is carried by mosquitoes. When mosquitoes feed on humans, they are able to transfer malaria to them, not in the UK, in other parts of the world because it's a particular type of mosquito. But malaria is an example of a protist. Once it gets into you, it sort of drains your energy and it makes you really quite ill. It's got lots of flu-like symptoms. As a result of mosquitoes being the vector for malaria, mosquitoes are the animal that is responsible by far for the greatest number of human deaths in history. Malaria kills thousands of people every year, and historically much more. Okay, And all these ways of spreading diseases, there are lots of ways in which we can prevent the spread of disease as well. We are all engaging in some of those ways right now, hopefully, while you're watching this. And we just need to know a little bit more about these things. So hygiene is a massive factor. Destroying vectors, isolating infected individuals. These are things that we're doing right now. Vaccinations are something that we're hoping will play a big part in getting us all out of this. And then these final four, destroying infected crops, crop rotation, chemical control and biological control, are all much more about preventing diseases in plants. You might think diseases in plants is very dull and very much not something that relates to you, but a disease that killed all the wheat plants in the world or all the tomatoes would have a very direct effect on you, a huge effect on the whole world. And so it's really important that we have at least some understanding of this. Okay, so your task, your first assignment this week is to talk a little bit more about these different ways that diseases can be spread, and then how the processes that we've just looked at, the different ways of stopping the spread of them, can be carried out. This is your first assignment. On there, these tables are there to fill in. I've created some help sheets which are also on the assignment, but you could also use bite size. You could use the rest of this video as I'm going to talk you through an example, and there are lots of other resources online. You don't need absolutely loads of work in here, but a reasonable amount. Okay, make sure you've got enough detail to be able to talk about how it's spread, how it stops the spread, and give me a nice example of each. Okay, so to help you with this, we'll look at an example. I think I'll do this on pen and paper, talk you a little bit through the coronavirus, how it spreads, and some of the strategies in which we are using to stop the spread. And then we'll come back to the slideshow for a final exam question. Okay, so I thought we would look at a little example of how diseases can be spread, or a couple of examples of how diseases can be spread, and ways in which we can prevent it. And I thought we would start by thinking about the example of coronavirus and start with a picture of me. I mean, obviously this was me, my ginger hair and my lovely Nike trainers. This was my attempt to draw a hoodie because I've pretty much given up on dressing in anything that could even resemble smart since I never leave the house now. Okay, so this is me, but if we imagine for the moment that I've got coronavirus, so how can we draw that? You get a temperature, don't you? So this is me, red with a temperature. I'm coughing, so not sure how you draw a cough. And I can have a runny nose as well. This is me with coronavirus. Not the best picture in the world. Okay, if you imagine I have that, the way coronavirus spreads is through contact. It is a disease that essentially requires you to come in direct contact with it. Okay, and so the reason coughing is bad for this is that when I cough, if you think of your disease as your pathogens that come out when you cough, this here, if you catch that cough in your hands, then the pathogen is now in your hands, and whenever you touch something, you place that pathogen, that virus, onto it. So if I've got this one with me, just with coronavirus now, and then I go around the college and I make myself a cup of tea and I leave it out on the side, it now has the pathogen on it as well. I go to a classroom, I touch the door handle to let myself in, that then has the pathogen on it as well. Any pens that I lend out to people, very quickly this pathogen gets absolutely everywhere because it's in contact and it survives on these materials for a few hours, and you pick it up and you take that that pathogen with you. And this is why, if we stop and we think about preventing the spread of it, it's why washing our hands is really important. If when I coughed I washed my hands afterwards, it wouldn't get anywhere else. And if you guys or the people coming in contact with these things were always washing their hands, then it wouldn't get any further than that either. In much the same way, it's why you shouldn't be touching your face. So if you get that pathogen on your hands and you don't wash them on your hands, it's unlikely to get into your body. It's unlikely that that virus will get in. But once you touch your face, you touch your eyes, your nose, your mouth, the pathogen's more likely to get in. It's going to start multiplying. That virus starts multiplying in your cells before bursting and getting all around your body. And actually, as much as the coronavirus is able to spread very, very effectively this way, it, I think, on average spreads to about 2.5 people, which is crazy high for an infectious disease. But this isn't the most effective way of a pathogen getting around. So some viruses, some bacteria are able to survive in the air, and those are the mega difficult pathogens to stop getting around, because if they can survive in the air, they'll move with the wind, the weather, and they'll get everywhere in the world. So those crazy people that think the coronavirus was made in a lab and weaponized and sent out to kill us all, it's pretty unlikely, because if you wanted to weaponize a pathogen, the best thing to do is to have an airborne one. Okay. In much the same way, if we think about malaria, which is spread through mosquitoes, if you think of yourself of a little mosquito, no idea what they look like really, something like this. They've got a little tongue thing, haven't they? This is my mosquito. Apologies for any mosquitoes watching, be insulted by this. What mosquitoes have, which means that they spread malaria so easily, is they've got wings like this, which means they can get all around the world very quickly and very effectively. Okay, they're super able to spread diseases. And going back to the coronavirus, the reason it spread just so effectively, so quickly, is because we fly now, and so we are able to move this pathogen around very quickly indeed. Okay, in terms of stopping the spread of coronavirus as our example, we've looked at one way in which we do that already. So if we think of them all, we do hygiene, we wash our hands. This is a great way of stopping pretty much any disease, any pathogen. Lots of hand washing, it prevents it getting into the body, it prevents it being able to breed, it prevents it really being able to spread quickly. So hygiene is really important. We should all have been washing our hands anyway, but at the moment particularly more important. Okay, then the next things, it's about isolating infected people. So if I've got the coronavirus, going back to my wonderful drawing here, what we should really be doing is isolating me, putting me away from the rest of the world. This is me in a box, so that then I wasn't able to touch any of these things, my cough wasn't going anywhere, I was completely isolated and unable to spread it further. And this is what the countries, the governments in the world that have done the best job at suppressing the coronavirus, at flattening that curve early, they were much more proactive than the UK in terms of isolating people with the pathogen early, with that virus. They tested lots of people. If they tested positive, they isolated them, and they tracked and isolated anyone they'd been in contact with, and it just cuts off any of this here. It cuts off the idea of you being able to pass it on to other people. In the same way, at the moment, we are all kind of taking part in this second bit, which is destroying vectors. So the vector for coronavirus is humans. Now, a very good way of eradicating the coronavirus would just be killing all the humans on Earth, but that would somewhat defeat the point. So what we are doing instead is we are keeping this 2 meters apart from everyone, or we see, or at least we should be. We are staying inside, and so we are effectively stopping the vector. We are stopping the spread of it by removing humans and removing that pathway for the coronavirus to spread from one person to the next. Okay, by isolating ourselves, by socially distancing ourselves, we are stopping this vector. We are stopping it from being able to move on. We are taking ourselves out, and so we're removing the vector. And this 2.5 people, this was before we went into lockdown. Now, or a couple of weeks ago at least, as the lockdown began, coronavirus now, someone with it is likely to infect 0.6 people, so less than one person, which is why the rate of infection is falling, why what we're doing is working, because now every one person that has the virus is likely to infect less than one other person, and that means numbers start to reduce, and eventually it should go away altogether, or at least at some point. And the final part of this is the idea of a vaccine, okay, which is really how we will eradicate or we're able to eradicate any disease. A vaccine provides everyone with immunity, or the vast majority of people with immunity towards a disease, which means you can't catch it in the first place, which means I would never have got it, and therefore I'd never be able to spread it. And you should all have vaccines against certain diseases already, and we are all protected by that. Once enough people are vaccinated, you have something which you might have heard in the news called herd immunity, and that means that enough people are protected against it, which means that the spread isn't able to be as fierce as we're currently seeing, because there just aren't enough vectors for it to spread between, because so many people are immune. Good. So using what we just went through there, plus the help sheets, it would be a good idea to now get on with the assignment before coming back, watching the very last bit of the video, which is me going through an exam question. Bye. So we'll finish with a final 6-mark question. If you missed any of that or found my drawings too terrible or my voice too rambly, in the slideshow version of this, all the chat that I just went through on preventing the spread of coronavirus is nicely typed up for you there as well. Okay, so to finish on this 6-mark question, it says some countries have set up centres where a person is counselled and tested for HIV. The aim is to reduce new infections by 50%. Describe how HIV is transmitted and how these centres can contribute to reducing the spread of HIV. So hopefully you've been aware, you've looked at HIV a little bit, or at least spoken about other examples of diseases that are spread through the transmission of infected bodily fluids. So the key thing with this is there's a couple of marks about talking about HIV generally, but most of it is just general knowledge on how diseases are spread, and how a centre, how testing, how things like that could stop the spread. So the first thing though is let's talk about HIV, get our marks for showing that we understand how HIV is spread and how these, and then go on to talk about how we can prevent the spread. So first mark, HIV is transmitted through the exchange of infected bodily fluids. So whether it is blood or something else, HIV, you need to come into direct contact with infected bodily fluids. And generally speaking, this is done in one of two ways: sharing needles or unprotected sex. This is the main way in which HIV is spread, these two different ways here, okay? So once you've got your 2 marks for showing, I know how HIV is transmitted, I know how it's spread, then it's going on to talk about how we can reduce the spread of it, okay? And the first thing that a centre like this can do is stop the sharing of needles and stop the unprotectedness of the sex. So it can provide clean needles or provide condoms. In the UK, you can get free condoms from walk-in centres, places like that. And if you go to Boots or Superdrug or any other pharmacy, they'll provide you with clean needles as well. So while injecting drugs is illegal, one of the best ways of reducing the strain on the NHS, of the cost of treating drug addiction on the NHS, or HIV at least, is to provide clean needles. So we do that. Then the other things are a little bit more around long-term stopping the spread. So by testing people, they can test whether and confirm whether you are HIV positive or not, whether you have that disease. And if you are, they can provide medicines to suppress the virus, to stop it getting worse and thus saving that person's life. But testing is so important because once someone knows they are positive for HIV, they can ensure that they are not spreading it on. So they know that under no circumstances they can share needles, or under no circumstances they can have unprotected sex. It is why testing for the coronavirus is going to be a huge win for us in order to go back to our regular lives. Once people know that they've got it, they know that they have to isolate, that they have to stay away, and it means that other people are able to carry on as normal. Okay, and this is the follow-up from that. If you know you've got that disease, you are far less likely to spread it. With these 6-mark questions, it's not enough just to say tests are good. People know whether they've got it or not. Make sure you follow that up with saying why that's good. If they know they've got a disease, they're far less likely to spread it. And these marks here, from 4 down to 6, they are all about our general knowledge of diseases. Okay, and the final thing, this is the most important thing for the spread of all diseases. The reason we know, or we now know, that HIV is spreaded through bodily fluids, the reason that we know that that coronavirus is spread through contact, all things like that, is because someone's told us, that we've been educated for it. And this is what these centres are really important for. They are able to educate people in practices of safe sex, of not sharing needles, but also just generally how HIV is spread, how it goes from person to person, and therefore people are much more likely to be careful. Without education, without knowing what to do and what not to do, diseases are far more likely to spread. It's why there were posters all up over the college about washing our hands. It's trying to educate people in order to stop the spread of something. Okay, great. So that's our first lesson of biology done. This should take us on for a good few weeks. Obviously, we don't quite know what's happening with schools at the moment, but this is a nice, interesting topic to take you, keep you going for a good few weeks. Okay, bye-bye.